EA is now on Twitch. Join us Wednesday nights when Alistair reads a bedtime story, and Sunday mornings for a few hours of chill casual gaming, plus interviews, special guests, pickup streams, and more. Visit twitch.tv/EA Podcasts and follow us to be notified when we go live, plus access VODs of past broadcasts.
Escape Pod, Episode 936. Old People's Folly, Part 2 of 2. By Nora Skinnell.
Hello, and welcome to Escape Pod, your weekly science fiction podcast. I'm your host this week, Tina Connolly, and I am here to bring you Part 2 of Old People's Folly by Nora Skinnell. This story first appeared in Future Science Fiction Digest. Now, this story has been broken into 2 episodes, and you are now about to hear Part 2. So, if you need to hear Part 1 first, this is your notice to stop the episode and go find Part 1. Nora Skinnell lives in a shared house in the outskirts of Vienna, Austria, and tries not to get confused by writing in English while speaking in German. When she isn't writing, she enjoys reading too much, playing video games for far too long, and finding shortcuts through the woods. She is very bad at being realistic, which is why her idea of a day job is working as an archaeologist, which sounds fun. Old People's Folly is her first published story and has also been reprinted in Best of World Science Fiction, Volume 3. Your narrator this week is Tatiana Gray. Tatiana Gray is a critically acclaimed actress of stage, screen, and the audio booth. She has been nominated for dozens of fancy awards, but hasn't won a single damn thing. She lives in Brooklyn, New York. See more about Tatiana at tatianagray.com. Your audio producer this week is Adam Pratt. And as a content notification, FYI, this sweet story has some homophobia and parental abuse in the course of it. So get ready to deal with the swarm of bees, because it's story time.
Kite was still curled into a bundle of blankets in front of the stove when Seti woke. The old woman sniffed, torn between surprise and annoyance. She'd have figured him for a quitter, sneaking out before dawn to escape the work. That's what she'd have done when she was his age. Not like Seti was in any shape to chase after him. But he'd stayed, and now she was stuck with him, just like she was stuck with her ghost. There was a thought to cheer her up in the morning. "Hey, boy!" The bundle of blankets stirred. Then Kite woke with a start. The bruise on his face looked worse in the harsh morning light, his cheek all swollen and purple. From the way he winced, it wasn't the only one, either. Seti dropped a bowl of oats on the table for him. "About time you start working for your food." She didn't stick around to see if he would eat, and instead snagged the ghost disc on her way out the door. The last thing she needed was the boy messing around with it. Her knee twinged in protest, objecting to yesterday's treatment, just like it did every day. Seti didn't have the luxury to heed her body's constant objections. It barely took 5 minutes before Kite emerged as well, still mute as a butterfly. Seti put the axe into his hand and pointed him at the pear tree, then shuffled off to plant some beans. To her surprise, it didn't take long for the telltale sound of the axe to start up. Maybe the boy would actually manage to strip the tree of its gnarled branches before he winged it. Maybe he was more than a pretty voice. Seti shook her head. Shouldn't get too optimistic. Maybe the ghost had made her go soft with her ideals and talk of change. With a grunt, Seti settled onto the ground next to her vegetable bed. She'd tried 1,000 different ways of planting seeds while bending down, and none of them had worked with a bad knee. Sitting in the dirt wasn't pretty, but it did the trick, and if she had it her way, there wouldn't be anyone around to see. The sound of chopping stopped after a suspiciously short amount of time. "Ms. Seti?" There was a strange look on Kite's face, excitement warring with confusion. His voice was still quiet, almost inaudible, as if he were ashamed to admit its existence. "What? Broke something already?" The reply came out harsher than Seti had intended. She didn't like it when people caught her helpless, and there wasn't much that screamed helplessness as loudly as crawling on the ground like a beetle on its back. Kite hunched his shoulders, but his expression didn't waver. He must have a shitty family if this kind of answer was business as usual for him. "There are bees." Seti rolled her eyes, but of course the boy wasn't finished. "Up in one of the trees. A whole bunch of them." With an unhappy grunt, Seti groped for her cane. Bad weather for swarming bees. Too cold, too windy, though obviously that fact hadn't gotten around to her swarm. The old woman grabbed the handle of her cane and miserably botched her first 2 attempts at getting up. The pain in her knee brought tears to her eyes. At least Kite had the good grace to look away and pretend not to notice. Not like the miller's son, who offered Seti his arm every time she went down to the village as if it were a courtesy to rub into her face how frail she was. The swarm of bees clung to one of the lower branches of the walnut tree, still a good 3 meters above the ground. Seti watched the insects buzz and crawl over each other in their need to stick as close to their queen as possible. That's what she got for allowing them to swarm. She'd left the extra queen in 2 of the hives so they would split up, with the old queen moving out in spring and half the swarm following, trying to find a new home. Seti had lost some hives over the winter, and it was a neat way of replenishing them. More hives couldn't hurt. Seti sniffed. Figuratively speaking, it couldn't hurt. Could hurt plenty falling off the ladder. Kite trudged after the old woman like a silent ghost, quite the opposite of the real ghost hiding somewhere in her disk. They dragged her ladder under the tree, and Kite went to fetch the new hive box, while Seti scowled at her cane and finally swallowed her pride. "You afraid of heights?" she asked when the boy returned. Kite shook his head. She'd figured that already, with him constantly perching on the edge of the cliffs. "You afraid of bees?" He hesitated for a second, then shook his head again. At least he'd stopped to think before answering. Seti had to give him that. "Think you can manage to catch the swarm?" Kite tilted his face up to study the buzzing mass of wings and stingers, his eyes more curious than concerned. As if for all his worry he simply lacked the capacity for fear. He shrugged. "What do you want me to do?" "Cut off the branch and carry it down the ladder. I'll put it in the box." Another shrug. "Okay." Despite being taller than her, Kite almost vanished under the hat and veil Seti put on his head. Some people just had a knack for vanishing. She watched him climb the ladder carefully, not quite frightened, but showing plenty of respect for her bees, and clutching the saw in his gloved hand like a weapon. A couple of bees took off when Kite started sawing, startled by the sudden vibration. It wasn't a heavy branch, a mere 2 fingers' breadth, easy work if you had 2 legs to keep balance. Kite almost dropped the whole branch with its sudden weight as he cut through, clusters of bees raining to the ground and taking up an angry buzz. Seti glowered at nobody in particular. Would hardly do to shout at the kid precariously perched on the ladder, but she was somewhat protective of her swarm, and she didn't want to scrape bees off the grass for the rest of the morning. Against her expectations, the boy held on, clutched the branch in both hands as the saw tumbled from his grip and clouds of bees took to the air. Seti fancied she could see the white in Kite's frightened eyes like a cornered deer. Slowly, step by step, the boy climbed down the ladder and handed Seti the branch with trembling fingers. Seti took it without hesitation, even with her hands bare. Swarming bees were at their most docile. No brood to defend, no food stocks to fight for. It didn't mean they wouldn't sting if provoked, But Seti had been stung plenty in her life. A little more pain wouldn't make any difference. She whacked the branch against the box, dropping most of the bees inside. The rest crawled around in confusion, trying to return to their queen. Seti gently brushed a few bees from the rim and closed the hive.
All right, boy. Time to give them some space.
Here. Seti pressed a jar of honey into Kite's hands. He'd earned it, and Seti wasn't good at thanking people. Lack of practice. She dug a bee stinger out of her hands rather than trying to think of something better to say. She'd have to wash properly to get the smell of dead bee off her, before checking on the new hive again. It made the rest of them aggressive. If the boy had been stung as well, he kept remarkably quiet about it. "Thank you for letting me stay the night," he mumbled at last, his hands fidgeting with the jar. He kept his gaze fixed to the ground, but Seti could still spot the resignation in his eyes. Nowhere else to go now, but home.
The bees like you,
Seti said. She was as bad at giving compliments as she was at thanking people. Not much use in trying at all.
Must be your singing voice.
At the mention of his singing, Kite's cheeks turned a bright crimson, but at least it had the intended effect of sending him on his way with nothing more than a stammered goodbye. Seti watched him scramble down the hill toward the village, strangely content. Not that he'd done much with the pear tree, but she figured catching the swarm was worth more to her anyway. When she turned around, Yasmin's translucent body was floating at her side. "Not bad for a start," the ghost smirked, flickered, and vanished before Seti could come up with the snide remark. Didn't take long for the boy to return, nor for the ghost. "What the hell is this?" Yasmin asked over Seti's shoulder.
"Beans,"
the old woman said. The earth was still damp after a day of incessant drizzling. The cold seeped into Seti's skirt and crawled up her bones, making her knee ache even more than usual. Cold had a way of ruining Seti's temper. Then again, so did a lot of things. The ghost hopped up and down like an excited child. "No, I mean—" She pointed. "Dirt." Seti cut her off. "But what's with all the colorful bits?" Seti pushed a bean seed from her hand into the dark soil, brimming with red and blue and yellow particles. It wasn't bad soil either, as good as you'd get on the cliffs.
"That's what dirt looks like."
"No, it doesn't," Yasmin protested. "I know what—" Suddenly the ghost's animated face turned all horrified. "Is this plastic? Shit! Microplastic? We really did fuck up the world." She plonked down, right in the middle of the vegetable bed, and hugged her insubstantial knees. Drama queen. Seti rolled her eyes and kept on planting beans. "Shitty battery," the ghost mumbled, her petulant tone causing Seti to glance over. The ghost's body had started flickering erratically, on and off in the middle of Seti's bean patch. The old woman wondered why she'd bothered putting the disc into the sun that morning. "Hey, here's the boy again!" The ghost jumped to her feet, still flickering. Even from a distance, and without seeing his face, Seti could tell Kite was crying. He ran straight for his place at the cliffs, body bowed as if against a storm. Seti buried her last seed and fumbled for her cane. She could at least pretend to give the boy some privacy. Kite's parents weren't about to do the same. The yelling started even before Seti had made it to the kitchen. She couldn't make out any words. Not that she had to, the cadence was clear enough. "What the hell?" Yasmin materialized in the middle of the room. Her flickering had grown worse, distorting not only her body, but also her voice, which made her sound more like a ghost than ever before.
"Do something."
Seti grimaced and hobbled for her chair.
"And what, exactly? Frighten them with a pink-haired ghost?"
Her fingers groped for a bowl of potatoes and a knife, more out of a need for distraction than any desire for preparing food.
"I'd make them piss their pants if my battery wasn't at 0.1%.
The ghost sniffed, then vanished for a whole second as if trying to prove her point.
"Fucking battery!"
Seti scoffed into her potatoes and remained seated.
"Then what do you want me to do? Limp over and smack them with my cane until they stop yelling? Not worth the pain. I have no claim on that boy."
Frustration flickered over Yasmin's body, plain enough through the distortion.
Really? You're gonna do nothing? What if he jumps off the cliff?
Seti started peeling her potatoes. She felt more like stabbing them.
Nah, would have done so already if he had the guts.
Quiet boy like Kite, he wouldn't jump in front of his parents. Too much of a mess. Too loud a statement.
But...
A muffled thud cut them both short. Seti glanced up and found Kite sprawled in the mud. No question about how he'd ended up there with his father stooping over him. She twisted her mouth in disgust and pretended not to watch the man drag his son away. The ghost had no such qualms. She stared out the window until the family vanished out of sight, then wheeled around, hands clenched into fists.
And you're just sitting here? Doing fucking nothing? Nothing at all?
Even through the flickering, Seti could spot the ghost's eyes burning with contempt. The old woman pursed her lips. She'd had about enough of accusations. Girl from another time, thinking she knew so much better. Maybe in her world you could have changed things with protesting loud enough and setting things on fire. Maybe in her world you didn't have to eat food that poisoned you, didn't have to do what somebody else thought was best. But this was Seti's world. In Seti's world, parents who clothed and fed you would always have the last say about your life. In Seti's world, there was nobody around to help you out of the goodness of their heart. In Seti's world, people fell off apple trees for no reason at all and got crippled for life because they landed unlucky.
World is what it is.
Seti drew her lips back in a bitter snarl.
Nothing you can do. No use fighting it.
You could easily hate it, though. Seti had plenty of experience in hating the world. The ghost came so close to Seti's face, the old woman imagined she would have tasted her breath if she'd had any. Yasmin's eyes were a pale gray and must have been almost translucent even when she'd still been alive.
Yes, the world is shit,
the ghost said. Anger bled through her voice despite the erratic up and down in volume.
The world has always been shit. Mine, yours. There's always been shittiness everywhere we go. And you know why? Because nobody bothers to do a thing about it. If everybody would change just a tiny little bit, the world would be fine. But instead we moan and we complain and we do nothing. And so nothing will ever change.
A bitter laugh escaped Seti's lips.
Pretty little lies you tell yourself.
She shifted her aching knee, feeling the urge to punch it for giving her trouble, but knowing from experience how much that would hurt. She wondered how many futile attempts it took for someone to realize struggle wasn't worth the pain. How many it had taken her.
Maybe I should run down to the village for a spell. Set a couple of buildings on fire. Worked so well for you, I should give it a try because you must have made the world a much better place. Look how great it turned out.
Yasmin flinched, as if the old woman had slapped her. Her eyes practically filled with tears, full of guilt and betrayal, as if whatever she'd done wasn't hundreds of years in the past, as if anyone would still care. The distortion in the ghost's body grew worse by the second. Convenient, wouldn't it be, to flicker out of existence right before answering? Seti was almost surprised when instead, Yasmin set her jaw as if against a blow. There were people inside, the ghost muttered through clenched teeth. Inside the court of justice. It was a weekend and late. I didn't know. 4 people. Only 2 made it out. Carefully, Seti placed her peeled potato back into the bowl. The ghost refused to meet her eyes and instead stared out the window where Kite and his parents had long since vanished. Yasmin turned around, hugging herself like a stubborn child.
I made a mistake, okay? I paid for it 1,000 fucking times, but you know what? At least I didn't sit around on my butt pretending it didn't matter what I did anyway. At least I tried.
And the ghost threw a last burning glare at Seti before she flickered out. Seti poked the polished disc with her finger. She'd put it in the sun 2 hours ago, and still Yasmin hadn't deigned to show her face. Seti should have known not even ghosts could stand her company for long. The old woman hobbled inside to fetch her shawl, and when she emerged, the ghost was suddenly there, floating right in the middle of her yard.
Where are you going?
Yasmin's voice was full of mistrust, still scrambled like an off-tune guitar. Seti sniffed and drew the shawl tight around her shoulders.
Going to check on the boy.
Yasmin narrowed her eyes, face full of suspicion. Something in her expression made Seti think she'd been crying, ghost tears that left her thick black mascara untouched. She was even more insubstantial than usual, like a candle about to burn down.
"What made you change your mind?"
she asked. Seti shrugged.
"Still got a pear tree that needs cutting down."
An annoyingly smug smile appeared on the ghost's face, barely marred by the twitching. Seti groped for something bitter and seething to add, but nothing came to mind, until she gave up and showed her irritation by walking right through Yasmin's insubstantial body. The sensation was a lot less otherworldly than she had expected. Didn't feel like anything at all, not even a cold shiver down her spine. Nothing but air.
"Hey, old lady!"
The ghost hollered after her. Seti rolled her eyes, but stopped reluctantly and turned around. Yasmin seemed more amused than angry, hands on her hips. But the next moment, her demeanor shifted into something fierce and final.
"Please do me a favor. If the battery gives out, smash the fucking handheld to pieces. I'm done being imprisoned."
Seti grimaced, an unexpected feeling of regret sneaking up on her. But still, she nodded.
"Course I will. But try to at least stick around until I return. I need someone to blame if I walk down to the village for nothing."
Seti banged her cane against the door, scowling. She hated coming down to the village, the loose pebbles on the path twisting her steps, the pitying glances and hushed voices of the village folk, like she was a curious animal, exotic and out of place. Kite's father wrenched the door open. He was a tall man, at least a head taller than Seti, broad shoulders and staring down at her in confusion.
"Need some help?"
Seti glared at him. Did it look like she needed help when she could still bash against his door with her cane?
"I need my apprentice,"
she demanded, not too friendly. Her knee hurt. The man's eyes narrowed in suspicion and he shook his head.
"No apprentice here." "Sure there is, that one."
Seti pointed her cane at Kite, who tiptoed into the room behind his father. His left cheek wasn't the only spot growing bruises anymore.
"Bit the worse for wear, but I take what I can get."
Her father's face warped from slight suspicion into open hostility in the blink of an eye, and he wasn't the only one.
"What do you think you're playing at, Seti?"
Kite's mother appeared right on her son's heels, all haughty stares and proud tilt of the chin. Seti had known her when they were both younger, 30-odd years ago, and even as a youngster that woman had had an attitude problem. Seti glared right back. She had more experience with it.
"Our boy's none of your business,"
the husband growled. Most people took him for a calm, almost stoic person, at least until the first time they watched him lose his temper. He took a step toward Seti, relying on his sheer bulk for intimidation, and then stopped in confusion when the old woman didn't back off. Seti sniffed. Not much threat and violence when taking a step backward too fast hurt her worse than a punch to the face. What was he going to do anyway? Hit her? That would score them points with the neighbors, hitting the village cripple.
"Ask him, then."
Seti shrugged into the tall man's face, or chest more like. She didn't think the boy would be of any help, had an expression like he wasn't even home, not hopeful, not afraid, like he'd just left his bruised face behind and nobody had noticed yet. But the boy surprised her again. Not the best thing in an apprentice to constantly surprise you. Kite gave an almost imperceptible shrug. "She's telling the truth," he said, calm as anything. "I already helped with the bees. I got stung." And he tugged at his pants to show them the stings. Seti's eyebrows rose, and a small complacent smile threatened to tug at her lips. Instead of acknowledging Kite's words, though, his father's eyes narrowed to slits, bouncing back and forth between the old woman and his son with menace.
"He stays with us. Get out or I'll throw you out,"
he said, moving even closer until she imagined she could smell the anger off his skin. So much for points with the neighbors.
"I don't know why you suddenly feel like meddling, but you have no say about my boy. He's gonna marry next year and it's none of your business."
Seti sniffed down her nose at him.
"Plenty of time for marrying after an apprenticeship."
Temper flared in the man's eyes, and for a second, Seti thought he really would push her into the dirt. There was a way to ruin her afternoon, walking back to her house with a broken leg. "Careful where you're steppin'," she hissed at him. Seti never had known when to back off, and by now, she was probably too old to learn. She nodded at her cane. "Not too steady, these legs. I might stumble and break my neck. Think your neighbors will be happy with that? No more honey for your bread. No more willow bark tea if you hurt your back." Had its uses, to have a village cripple in town, someone who is in pain so constantly she'd learned all about herbal remedies and pain-killing teas. "No more feverfew for your headache returns. No more valerian tea if the nightmares get too bad." All the little hurts that they thought nobody knew about until they started bartering for Seti's herbs. Kite's father went pale. Maybe fear, maybe anger, who could tell? The way she remembered, his back made him scream with pain every harvest season. "What do you even want?" Kite's mother glared at Seti as if glaring was all it took to make her leave. She was the one with the bad headaches. "My apprentice," Seti repeated. Irritation hung in the air like syrup, thick and heavy, but neither of the boy's parents dared to shut the door in her face. A lopsided smile snuck onto Seti's face. She'd never tried to blackmail the villagers before, and it was somewhat satisfying to know that it worked. It wasn't so much the threat of keeping her medicine to herself, she assumed, but the fact that she knew all their flaws. Nobody wanted to end up in the bad books of somebody who knew their flaws. The old woman raised her eyebrow at Kite, and for a moment he seemed about to vanish into the depths of the house to gather his things. Then thought better of it. Seti didn't take her eyes off his parents until the door was solidly closed between them and their son. Kite looked almost stunned at his escape. A sleepwalker awoken in an unfamiliar place, lost and confused. The ghost would love this. "Thank you," Kite mumbled. Seti rolled her eyes. "Wait until you have to walk up the cliffs with me. You don't know how slow a cripple can walk, and you're gonna stay right beside me." A shy smile twitched across the boy's lips. At least he had some sense of humor. Seti sighed. This wouldn't be the last she heard of Kite's parents. She started hobbling back in the direction of her house, and the boy fell into step beside her. Foolish idea, to take him in. What had come over her? She knew it wouldn't take long to regret her decision. Maybe it was the ghost's nagging, or maybe she'd gotten used to having somebody to complain to. She glanced at the boy out of the corner of her eye as they walked, watched the idea of something akin to freedom slowly dawning on his face. She shook her head. Ideals. Old people's folly.
And we are back, and again, that was the second and final part of Old People's Folly by Nora Schnurl, narrated by Tatiana Gray. Last week, I told you some of Nora's thoughts on the story, so this week I'll bring you mine. Nora said that part of Seti's grumpiness came out of her being sick while writing this story. And I loved Seti's grumpiness. I was reminded recently of a piece of writing advice I picked up somewhere. And forgive me, I don't remember where, but please let me know if you do. But basically it asked the question, can the protagonist change enough in time to reach a happy ending? And I thought about that in relation to this story, because Seti's grumpiness and set-in-her-waysness is understandable. And we can all see the happy ending that this story could reach if Seti is able to change in time. And that happy ending is definitely worked for and earned. I also like that we have the catalyst of the pink-haired ghost, Jasmine, the activist out of time, who is unsparing with her thoughts about the situation. Seti needs her, and the story needs her, because Seti would never have changed on her own, just watching the boy from a distance. She actively needs the ghost to prod her along. And then Nora leaves the door open at the end of the story, so to speak. We get to decide for ourselves part of what happens next. But I definitely believe that Jasmine chooses to stick around a while longer, and they all become part of one unique but wonderful found family. Escape Pod is part of the Escape Artist Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit, and this episode is distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Don't change it, don't sell it, please go forth and share it. How do you share it, you ask? Well, in addition to your social media of choice, consider rating and or reviewing us on podcast listening sites such as Apple or Google. More reviews makes for more discoverability, makes for more Escape Pod for you. You can't lose. Escape Pod relies on the generous donations of listeners exactly like you. And remember that Patreon subscribers have access to exclusive merchandise and can be automatically added to our Discord, where you can chat with other fans as well as our staff members. So, if you enjoyed our story this week, then consider going to escapepod.org or patreon.com/EAPodcasts and casting your vote for more stories that suggest that even if you can't change the entire world, you can still find a way to do a small, good thing. Our opening and closing music is by Daikaiju at daikaiju.org. And our closing quotation this week is from J.R. Dawson in The First Bright Thing, who says, "Family finds us, even if we're born in different places, to different homes." Thanks for listening, and have fun.